Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a case that, honestly, reads like a thriller.
Yeah.
It's one of those stories where literature and politics and international intrigue, they all just kind of come crashing together. And we're going to be talking about Boualem Sansal,
Right.
a French-Algerian writer whose work has kind of landed him in some pretty hot water recently.
Well, and what I think is so captivating about this whole situation is that it's not just about this one man.
Right.
Sansal's arrest has really ignited this huge debate about freedom of speech, but also about historical narratives and how those narratives end up getting tied up with all these geopolitical power plays.
Yeah, you pull on a thread and the whole tapestry starts to unravel, right?
Exactly.
So we've got a pretty hefty stack of sources for this deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
We've got news articles, historical text, even some pretty strongly worded op-eds.
For sure.
And our goal is to sort of help you navigate this really complex case.
Right.
Understand the accusations that are being made against Sansal and then kind of explore these global ripple effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case with implications that go way beyond just Algeria. So to really wrap our heads around it, we need to understand this man at the center of it all.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's start by getting to know Boualem Sansal.
Right. This writer who has become such a lightning rod for controversy.
Exactly.
And, he's not just a writer.
Right.
He's a provocateur. I mean, his work really dissects Algerian society and the complexities of Islam. He uses satire and allegory to kind of expose what he sees as hypocrisy and those kind of darker sides of power dynamics.
Yeah, and he's won some pretty prestigious awards too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He won the Grand Prix du Roman de l'Académie Française back in 2015 for his novel 2084, La Fin du Monde. And you would think that that kind of recognition would almost afford him some level of protection.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like his success might be what made him a target.
Okay.
I mean, he was recently granted French citizenship.
Right.
And that move just further inflamed tensions with the Algerian government.
And then, of course, on November 16th, he was arrested at Algiers airport.
Right.
And initially, there was all this secrecy surrounding the reasons for his detention.
Yeah.
But when the charges came out, it sent shockwaves through the literary world and beyond.
I mean, the Algerian authorities, they charged him with atteinte à l'unité nationale,
Right.
which translates to attack on national unity.
Okay.
And that's a charge that could carry a life sentence.
A life sentence.
Yeah.
For words on a page.
I know.
It's kind of a chilling thought when you think about it.
It is.
And I think it really speaks volumes about how the Algerian regime views dissent, particularly when it comes to sensitive historical narratives.
It is chilling. And, it really echoes these experiences of countless writers throughout history who dared to challenge those in power.
And the accusations didn't stop there, though, did they?
No, they did not.
You had Algerian state media, even some figures in France labeling him a traitor, saying that he was pushing Zionist and colonialist agendas.
Right.
I mean, this is a tactic that's as old as time, right? But what I think is interesting here is how it's being used in conjunction with these accusations of, pushing these foreign agendas.
Right.
I mean, that adds a whole other layer of complexity, wouldn't you say?
It does. And it's almost like this labeling of Sansal as a traitor. It serves this dual purpose.
Right.
It discredits him in the eyes of the Algerian public, but it also paints him as this tool of foreign powers, which then further justifies his arrest in their eyes.
So it's really interesting that there was an attempt to counter that narrative.
Right. There was.
It was almost like a symbolic rescue mission.
Yeah, it was Jean-Christophe Ruffin,
Right.
who's a member of the Académie Française, which is kind of like France's literary hall of famer, you could say.
Right.
He tried to get Sansal elected to the Academy in absentia.
Wow.
It was this really bold move, hoping that the prestige of being a member of that academy would offer Sansal some protection.
So they were trying to shield him with this international recognition.
Exactly.
But it ultimately failed, right?
It sadly, yeah.
Which really highlights the sensitivity surrounding this whole case.
I mean, the political pressure was just too great.
Yeah, but the response from the global community has been pretty swift and fierce, hasn't it?
Absolutely. The international community has condemned Algeria's actions. Some are even drawing comparisons to really authoritarian regimes.
Right.
The European Parliament issued a particularly strong condemnation and even hinted at possible sanctions against Algeria.
Wow, so Algeria is facing some serious diplomatic fallout here.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what specifically about Sansal's work pushed them to this point? What made his writing such a threat in their eyes?
Well, one of the key areas that Sansal's work has focused on is the historical borders between Morocco and Algeria,
Okay.
and particularly the disputed ownership of cities like Oran and Tlemcen.
Right.
He's been digging into all these historical texts and maps that actually challenge the official Algerian narrative about these regions.
So he's wading into that very, age-old frontier debate,
He is.
which is a really touchy subject,
Yeah.
especially for a regime that really prides itself on, their particular version of history.
Absolutely. And to give you an example of just how controversial this is, Sansal points to a 16th century Ottoman map,
Okay.
which is included in your sources,
Mm-hmm.
which actually places Oran firmly within a Moroccan administrative zone.
Wow.
And that directly contradicts the current Algerian narrative.
So basically, this historical research has placed him right at the heart of a very real geopolitical tug-of-war.
Exactly. This seemingly isolated arrest is actually tied up with much larger regional power dynamics.
Wow.
But before we get into that, there's another layer of complexity I think we need to kind of unpack here.
Okay, and this is where we dive into the French political landscape and this whole concept of Islamo-Gauchism.
That's right now, Islamo-Gauchism is a pretty hotly debated term.
Yep.
It's used by critics to describe what they see as this alliance between leftist ideologues and Islamist movements,
Okay.
which they argue leads to a suppression of criticism of Islam, all in the name of tolerance.
And so this ideology is playing a role in how different segments of French society are reacting to Sansal's arrest.
Absolutely. I mean, while there's widespread condemnation of Algeria's actions,
Right.
there are also these internal divisions within France about how to actually respond to this whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
And some argue that Islamo-Gauchism helps to explain why some left-leaning politicians and media outlets have been relatively muted in their defense of Sansal.
So we have this writer, internationally recognized, suddenly labeled a traitor facing a life sentence for his work.
Yeah.
This is where it gets interesting, wouldn't you say?
It really does, and it raises all these really crucial questions about the limits of free speech, particularly when it collides with these sensitive historical narratives and geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder that even in a country like France, that prides itself on this commitment to freedom of speech,
Yeah.
the right to dissent is not always absolute.
Absolutely not. I mean, the complexities of this case are only just beginning to unfold.
Right, and that's where we'll pick things up next time, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
We've been talking about the facts of Boualem Sansal's arrest and the international response.
Right.
But this whole situation, it's become a flashpoint in this much larger conversation
Mm-hmm.
about the role of writers and intellectuals in society.
What's fascinating to me is that it goes beyond just this typical debate about censorship.
Right.
It really digs into the nature of dissent and its place in a world where challenging established narratives can have these really serious consequences.
Yeah, I mean, he's essentially become a symbol of this literary traitor, right?
I salute him.
Someone who dares to question these kind of accepted truths, particularly those that are tied to national identity and history.
Exactly. And thinkers like Ali Ben Saad Smail Lasher and Jean-Marie Le Clavetine, whose works are included in your sources, by the way, have really explored this phenomenon in depth. And they argue that these critical thinkers like Sansal, they actually act as a kind of societal immune system.
That's a really striking analogy.
Yeah, right?
What do they mean by that?
Well, Ben Saad, for example, he argues that by challenging those accepted truths figures like Sansal, they force a society to re-examine its own beliefs and assumptions.
Okay.
They expose the potential flaws in the system, even if that process is uncomfortable or sparks outrage.
So while some see Sansal as a traitor, others view him as someone performing this vital function,
Yeah.
pushing society to confront its blind spot.
Exactly. It's a perspective that challenges us to consider whether silencing dissenting voices ultimately weakens the society.
Right.
Makes it more vulnerable to manipulation and just stagnation.
Makes you wonder, is there ever truly a safe space for dissent?
Right?
I mean, even in countries that claim to uphold freedom of speech,
Mm-hmm.
there always seem to be these invisible lines that once crossed can lead to some pretty serious repercussions.
Yeah, you hit on a really crucial point here. Sansal's case isn't unique to Algeria.
Right.
We see this dynamic playing out all over the world.
Yeah.
Governments and powerful groups, they often use accusations of treason or undermining national unity to silence anyone who challenges their authority.
Or their version of history.
Or their version of history,
Yeah,
exactly.
it seems like the pen can indeed be mightier than the sword,
It can.
but it can also make you a target.
It certainly can, and that brings us back to this really difficult position that France finds itself in.
Right?
How do they balance this commitment to freedom of speech
Mm-hmm.
with their desire to maintain a good relationship with Algeria?
Right. It's a very delicate diplomatic dance.
It is.
I mean, on the one hand, they can't ignore the plight of a French citizen who's been imprisoned for expressing his views.
Right.
On the other hand, they don't want to jeopardize this relationship they have with a key partner in a very volatile region.
Right. And it's further complicated by the fact that there are very differing opinions within France itself. There's a segment of the population that's very sympathetic to Sansal's plight.
Right.
And they're pushing the government to take a very strong stance in his defense.
But then you have those who see him as a troublemaker.
Yeah.
Someone who's brought this on himself by stirring up controversy.
Right. And it's not just a diplomatic dilemma for France, it's a political one, too.
Mm-hmm.
And with potential ramifications for regional stability, the stakes are really high.
So let's play out some potential scenarios.
Yeah.
What could happen to Sansal?
Right.
And how might this whole thing impact Franco-Algerian relations in the long run?
Well, one possibility, and it seems unlikely given the current climate,
Yeah.
is that the Algerian government bows to international pressure, or they make some internal calculations that lead them to release Sansal and drop the charges.
Okay, but what if they don't?
Right.
What if he's left to languish in prison, potentially, for years?
That's a very real possibility, unfortunately, and it would have some pretty far-reaching consequences. Not only would it damage Algeria's international reputation even more and potentially lead to sanctions,
Right.
but it would also really exacerbate tensions with France,
Mm-hmm.
making it even harder for them to cooperate on issues like counterterrorism and regional security.
So it seems like kind of a lose-lose situation for everyone involved.
In many ways it is.
Yeah.
For Sansal, it's a personal tragedy being punished for exercising his right to free speech.
Of course.
For France, it's a diplomatic headache with no easy solutions.
Right.
And for Algeria, it's a public relations disaster that further tarnishes their image on the global stage.
It's a stark reminder that the struggle for freedom of expression is ongoing,
Yeah.
and that in many parts of the world, writers and intellectuals, they face persecution just for speaking their minds.
And it raises this really fundamental question that goes beyond the specific case.
Okay.
What price are we as a global community willing to pay for the right to think freely and to express our ideas without fear of reprisal?
Right. Are we willing to stand up for those whose voices are being silenced, even when it's inconvenient or politically risky to do so?
Exactly.
Those are some pretty weighty questions that we all need to grapple with,
Yeah.
not just in the context of this case, but in our own lives as well.
And, while this situation raises all these troubling questions about censorship and the suppression of dissent,
Right.
it also shines a light on this enduring power of ideas. Sansal's words have sparked this global conversation.
Right.
It's forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths about history power and the limits of tolerance.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable obstacles,
Right.
the human spirit and the drive to express that spirit can find a way to break through.
Absolutely. But I think we've only just scratched the surface of this multifaceted case.
Okay.
There's another layer we need to peel back here.
Okay.
One that reveals how this seemingly isolated event is actually intertwined with these larger geopolitical power struggles.
Ah, yes. The Morocco connection.
That's right.
This is where things get even more intriguing, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Buckle up, because we're about to delve into this intricate web of alliances and rivalries that are playing out in the shadows of this case.
So we've explored the accusations against Boualem Sansal.
Yeah.
And the international outrage and these heated debates within France.
Right.
But now we're going to turn our attention to kind of a fascinating twist in this whole story,
Mm-hmm.
the Morocco connection.
It's here that we can really see how a seemingly isolated arrest like this gets tangled up in this much larger web of regional power dynamics.
Right.
Remember how Sansal's research challenged those historical narratives surrounding the borders between Morocco and Algeria?
Right. Those disputed cities, or in Tlemcen,
Exactly.
these places where history and geography collide.
Precisely by unearthing these historical claims, Sansal kind of unwittingly stepped onto this geopolitical minefield.
Right.
And the timing of his arrest coinciding with these heightened tensions between Algeria and Morocco
Uh-huh.
over the Western Sahara conflict, it really raises some eyebrows.
So are we suggesting that Algeria might be using Sansal's case to send a message to Morocco?
It's a possibility we have to consider. I mean, after all that attack on national unity charge against Sansal,
Right.
it could easily be interpreted as a message, not just aimed at internal dissent, but also at these external rivals.
So it's like they're trying to achieve two objectives at once.
Right.
Silence a critic, but also reinforce their regional dominance.
Exactly. And this puts France in a really precarious position.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they already have this complex relationship with Algeria,
Right.
trying to balance economic ties and security cooperation with concerns about human rights and freedom of expression. And now they have to factor in their relationship with Morocco as well.
Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
I know, it's a tough spot.
Yeah, France has these strong ties with both countries. And taking sides in this dispute could have some pretty serious diplomatic and economic consequences.
It really could. This situation calls for some really deft diplomacy.
Right.
France needs to find a way to advocate for Sansal's release without alienating Algeria or jeopardizing their relationship with Morocco.
It's a high-stakes balancing act, for sure.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
it's clear that Boualem Sansal's arrest, it's much more than a case of censorship.
Yeah.
It's a story about the power of ideas and the fragility of free speech. And this really complex interplay between historical narratives and geopolitical rivalries.
And it leaves us with some big questions.
It does.
Like, what does this case tell us about the limits of dissent in a world where challenging these official narratives can have such a heavy price?
Right. What does it say about the role of writers and intellectuals in society?
Exactly.
Are they simply meant to reflect the status quo, or do they have a duty to challenge it, even at great personal risk?
And what does this case tell us about the future of Franco-Algerian relations, especially in the context of this really shifting geopolitical landscape?
Those are all questions that deserve further exploration and debate.
Absolutely.
And we really encourage you, our listeners, to delve into the sources that we've provided, form your own conclusions, and continue to engage with these complex and vitally important issues.
I mean, because this struggle for freedom of expression,
Right.
this fight for the right to think critically and challenge these established narratives, it's a struggle that concerns all of us.
It's a struggle that transcends borders and ideologies and political systems.
It goes to the very heart of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
To question, to explore, to seek truth, and to speak our minds, even when it's hard.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those minds open.